Prior to the dawn of consciousness, mankind lived an unconscious and instinctual life, and was no different from the animals that lived in a similar manner. Early humans were still quite intelligent, however, and capable of making tools, starting fires, and organizing themselves into tribes. However, these skills don't require any conscious awareness, and are transmitted through imitation and learning. Just as chimpanzees learn to use a stick as a tool for catching ants from watching and imitating other chimpanzees, early humans could learn complex skills by imitating others. Through operant conditioning, imitation, and constant repetition, we learn to adapt to our environments, and there is no consciousness needed for this process. However, as human societies became more complex, the mentality we know of as consciousness began to emerge to help guide humans through the complexities of societal living. We've discussed the origins of consciousness in the context of neurology and language, but symbols have historically played an important role in the history and stadial development of consciousness, because ideas expressed in symbolic form become metaphorical objects in consciousness. As stated in these two videos, consciousness can be described as a process of creating metaphors about the world in an attempt to understand the world in a way that feels familiar to us. These metaphors are an attempt to describe the world and distill it in a way that makes it possible to comprehend. It is almost as though we are creating a mental map filled with various concepts, and being conscious of something is when we apply these learned, metaphorical concepts. Consciousness, in this sense, is the intersection between the real world and the mental, imaginary world of metaphors. By producing these concepts through metaphor, humans have become conscious of the world and of ourselves to an amazing degree. As new generations build upon and add to the knowledge gathered by past generations, the scope of our collective consciousness grows enormously, as the Jungian analyst Erich Neumann remarked in his book, The Origins and History of Consciousness. The structure of modern consciousness rests on this integration, and at each period of development, the ego has to absorb essential portions of the cultural past transmitted to it by the canon of values embodied by its culture and system of education. As time progresses, each successive generation gains a wider field of consciousness. Creative evolution of ego consciousness means that, through a continuous process stretching back over thousands of years, the conscious system has absorbed more and more unconscious contents, and progressively extended its frontiers. Just as humanity as a whole becomes more and more conscious, each individual must also trace the stages of conscious development within their own lives. In the modern world, language has become so sophisticated that children are able to become conscious of themselves with little difficulty. Words like I and me give them access to concepts of the self, and so they begin to recognize their own existence and become conscious. You may remember a time in your childhood when you became conscious of your own existence, perhaps when you looked at yourself in the mirror. The world before self-awareness emerges, i.e., while a person is still unconscious, is quite different from the state of being a self-reflecting, conscious being. The world is experienced as all-embracing, and in it man experiences himself as a self, sporadically and momentarily only. Just as the infantile ego, living this phase over again, feebly developed, easily tired, emerges like an island out of the ocean of the unconscious, for occasional moments only, and then sinks back again, so early man experiences the world. Small, feeble, and much given to sleep, i.e. for the most part unconscious, he swims about his instincts like an animal. Understanding difficult abstract concepts is possible for people today because our language accommodates these ideas. But historically, such ideas were difficult for primitive humans to grasp and understand. The role of the symbol is to aid humans in understanding abstract concepts, making them accessible to the minds of early humans and allowing consciousness to grow into new and unfamiliar territory. In analytical psychology, the word symbol has a particular definition. What we call a symbol is a term, a name, or an image, which in itself may be familiar to us, but its connotations, use, and application are specific or peculiar and hint at hidden, vague, or unknown meaning. A term or image is symbolic when it means more than it denotes or expresses. It has a wider unconscious aspect, an aspect that can never be precisely defined or fully explained. Symbols are metaphors, which are meant to express, in picture form, ideas which mankind may be trying to understand. By pondering the meaning of these symbols, mankind is introduced to enigmatic concepts which he had no prior knowledge of. In exploring the symbol, the mind is finally led towards ideas of a transcendent nature, where our reason must capitulate. Because there are innumerable things beyond the range of human understanding, we constantly use symbolic expressions and images when referring to them. Early cultures had a tendency to produce symbols using things which could be found in their environments, turning these into metaphors which allowed them to think deeply about the nature of the world. For example, a woman's womb is often used as a metaphor to understand the concept of origins, and this produces ideas like the idea that mankind originated from the womb of Mother Earth. In understanding consciousness, the metaphor of the sun rising and producing light is often used in contrast to the dark and veiled nature of the unconscious. The idea that consciousness is like light is a nearly universal theme in religions. The coming of consciousness, manifesting itself as light in contrast to the darkness of the unconscious, is the real object of creation mythology. Birds commonly appear as a symbol representing the upwards climb of consciousness towards the light. One way in which symbols operate is by introducing notions which seem paradoxical. To understand this, we will use the example of the Ouroboros. This is a very common symbol which can be found in many places, from Egypt to medieval Europe. It shows a snake or a lizard eating its own tail and regrowing. If we imagine how this symbol appeared in the minds of our ancestors, they would perceive it as a dying creature, being reborn in a perpetual cycle. Thus, this symbol produces the concept of eternity, timelessness, and it also helps man to become conscious of the concept of time itself. The symbolic thinking portrayed in these images of the round endeavors to grasp contents which even our present-day consciousness can only understand as paradoxes, precisely because it cannot grasp them. The fact that the Ouroboros is a circle also helps to deepen its meaning, as circles commonly appear as symbols representing eternity. Circle, sphere, and round are all aspects of the self-contained, which is without beginning and end. In its pre-worldly perfection, it is prior to any process, eternal, for in its roundness there is no before, no after, no time, and there is no above and no below, no space. All of this can only come with the coming of light, of consciousness. The concept of eternity makes no sense to man's predicament, because as far as he can tell, he did not always exist, but came into being from a womb. However, by pondering the concept of eternity, which presents itself as a symbol, a primitive man may begin to become conscious of his own existence and begin to wonder about his origins. Hence, the Ouroboros is a symbol for the unconscious state of man, the time before the emergence of consciousness, and it represents the state of the world prior to awareness. The concept of eternity makes man aware of the fact that his own life is not eternal, whereas before he simply wasn't aware of this fact or never thought about it deeply. The visual aspect of the symbol also strengthens its ability to evolve consciousness, because images help to condense the meanings they convey. Images and symbols have this advantage over the paradoxical, philosophical formulations of infinite unity and unimaged wholeness, that their unity can be seen and grasped as a unity at one glance. This is the power of symbols, as they make man aware of a wide scope of ideas which he never previously cared to ponder. The act of becoming conscious consists in the concentric grouping of symbols around the object, all circumscribing and describing the unknown from many sides. In addition to becoming conscious of enigmatical concepts, the symbol also helps humans to understand their own psyche. The development of consciousness in archetypal stages is a transpersonal fact, a dynamic self-revelation of the psychic structure, which dominates the history of mankind and the individual. Symbolic expressions help to make early man aware that he was looking at the world through his own subjective point of view. Creating a symbol which represents the internal state of affairs leads to a consciousness of the self, that there is a self which exists independently of the world. The first discovery is that of the self, although this discovery is actually of the ego, which is confused as the entirety of the self. Before this concept of the self arises, mankind is absorbed into the collective psyche of the group, and he has not differentiated himself as an individual who exists and thinks independently of the group. In the history of mankind, as in the development of the individual, there is an initial preponderance of transpersonal factors, and only in the course of development does the personal realm come into view and achieve independence. Producing symbolic imagery is a creative act and can be seen as an attempt by mankind to express and understand different parts of his psyche, and give them form so that they can be understood as objects in consciousness. It is also an attempt to throw light upon concepts and ideas which are foreign to his mind. Each new generation of symbols widens the scope of consciousness, and so consciousness grows in successive stages. Neumann and Jung observed that consciousness seems to grow in stages of symbolic revelation, and each symbol produces an idea, and the successive symbols build upon this idea to widen the scope of conscious awareness. These symbolic expressions also help the individual to become conscious of his or her personality, and helps him feel like an individual rather than a member of a group. The mythological stages in the evolution of consciousness begin with the stage when the ego is contained in the unconscious, and lead up to a situation in which the ego not only becomes aware of its own position and defends it heroically, but also becomes capable of broadening and relativizing its experiences through the changes affected by its own activity. This evolution of consciousness is not only the process of becoming aware of the world, but also becoming aware of the psyche, and this corresponds to the development of the ego. Once people become conscious of the fact that they exist, their first natural question is, where did I come from? Creation myths are an attempt to answer this question, and they are often filled with symbols which are meant to represent the peculiar state of consciousness emerging from the unconscious. Mythological accounts of the beginning must invariably begin with the outside world, for world and psyche are still one. There is as yet no reflecting, self-conscious ego that could refer anything to itself, that is, reflect. Creation stories create a kind of background in which a society functions, and most creation stories are as much about the origins of consciousness as they are about the origins of the world itself. The symbolic story of the beginning, which speaks to us from the mythology of ages, is the attempt by man's childlike pre-scientific consciousness to master problems and enigmas which are mostly beyond the grasp of even our developed modern consciousness. Mythological symbolism is filled with archetypal imagery and motifs, which helps mankind to recognize the images and themes which arise from his own inner mentality, thus granting him an awareness of his own psychology. Archetypes can be thought of as instinctual mental predispositions, which every human has, which arise from the unconscious, and hence the unconscious is the origin of symbolic imagery. A simple example would be the mother archetype, as every child is born with an innate desire to form a bond with their mothers. Because archetypes are active in every person, there is a tendency of mythological and artistic expression, especially of archaic forms, to be filled with archetypes, and recognizing these archetypes as they appear in myths helps the unconscious individual recognize the components of his own psyche. Ego consciousness evolves by passing through a series of eternal images, and the ego, transformed in the passage, is constantly experiencing a new relation to the archetypes. Being aware of these internal components also enables one to act contrary to their own instincts, just as consciousness today allows you to make decisions which go far beyond the natural instincts. In this way, consciousness allows a society to grow in many unforeseen directions. Mythology and religion are filled with symbols of this sort. The hero's myth, for example, symbolizes the breaking away from tradition in order to find new, more fulfilling ways of living, thus becoming a unique individual. The symbols present in a given hero story represent the necessary stages in the individuation process. The first phase of consciousness is when the ego splits from the self, and feels itself as an independent entity in the world, and this is also the first stage of the hero's myth. Breaking from societal norms is necessary for allowing a society to grow beyond the confines of what is familiar and safe. The individualized conscious man of our era is a late man, whose structure is built on early, pre-individual human stages, from which individual consciousness has only detached itself step by step. Ever since the new mentality of consciousness developed in our ancestors, mankind has been attempting to climb upwards into higher and higher realms of conscious awareness. The struggle between the specifically human and the universally natural constitutes the history of man's conscious development. In upcoming videos, we will look at the specific stages in the evolution of consciousness, and study the symbols which mankind has utilized in the task of understanding his predicament.